The moment my daughter-in-law pointed at me and told the security guards to remove me from my own son's company event, I thought the worst pain in my life had already happened. I was 67 years old, wearing the same navy dress I had worn to my husband's funeral, standing alone in a ballroom filled with wealthy investors and flashing cameras. My son, Michael, looked at me but said nothing. "Please escort her outside," Olivia said loudly. "She's making our guests uncomfortable." The guards began walking toward me. I reached for my purse, ready to leave before my tears fell. But before either man touched my arm, a chair scraped against the marble floor. Then another, and another. One of the most powerful investors in the room slowly stood up and said, "If Nancy Whitaker leaves, we all leave." Nobody in that ballroom knew what was about to happen next. If this story touches your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I would also love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been judged by your appearance or forgotten by the people you sacrificed everything for? Please share your feelings in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. 3 years had passed since my husband, Richard Whitaker, died. But every morning, I still reached for the other side of the bed before I remembered that it had been empty for a very long time. The first few seconds after waking were always the cruelest. For 42 years, Richard had been the first person I saw every morning. He had a habit of humming softly while making coffee, and even after retirement, he would sit by the kitchen window reading the newspaper while sunlight filled the room. Now the only sound inside my house came from the old clock in the hallway and the creaking wooden floors beneath my feet. I still lived in the same house we had bought when Michael was 6 years old. It wasn't large. It certainly wasn't impressive, but every room carried a memory. The kitchen still had the scratch marks on the cabinet where Michael had measured his height every birthday. The living room still held Richard's favorite leather chair. His reading glasses remained inside the top drawer beside the lamp because I could never bring myself to move them. People often told me that I should sell the house. Even Michael had suggested it. "Mom, the place is too big for you now," he had said several times. "You could move into a condo downtown. It would be easier." But what he never understood was that this house was not simply wood and paint. It was my marriage. It was my family. It was the proof that Richard and I had built something together. After Richard died, the days became very quiet. At first, Michael visited every Sunday. Olivia came with him, always dressed beautifully, carrying expensive flowers and bottles of wine I never drank. They stayed for lunch. Michael talked about business. Olivia talked about charity galas, social events, and the growing success of Whitaker Living. I listened. I smiled. I asked questions. But slowly, the visits became less frequent. Sunday lunches turned into monthly dinners. Monthly dinners turned into short phone calls. Eventually, even those became rare. Whenever I called Michael, he sounded exhausted. "I'm sorry, Mom. Things are crazy at the office. We have investors visiting. We're traveling. We'll come by next week." Next week often became next month. I never blamed him. At least, I tried not to. Richard and I had worked ourselves nearly to death when we were younger. I knew what building a company demanded from a person. Long hours, sacrifice, stress. But there was a difference between being busy and forgetting, and sometimes I wondered if my son had forgotten me. Most mornings, I kept myself occupied. I watered the roses Richard had planted. I attended church. I volunteered twice a month at the local library. I baked pies that I usually ended up giving to neighbors because there was nobody at home to eat them. The hardest time of day was dinner. For 40 years, I had cooked for my husband and my son. Suddenly, I was making soup for one person. One evening, while washing dishes, I found myself setting 2 plates on the table out of habit. I stood there, staring at them. One plate for me, one for Richard. I sat down and cried harder than I had in months. The loneliness of widowhood doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in tiny moments. An empty chair, a silent phone, a birthday card signed by only one hand. Several months after Richard's funeral, Olivia invited me to lunch. She chose an expensive restaurant downtown that I would never have visited on my own. She arrived 20 minutes late. Her phone rang several times during the meal. She spoke about branding, investors, market positioning, and social media campaigns. At one point, she smiled politely and said, "Nancy, the company has changed so much. It's become very modern." I smiled back. "I'm glad to hear that." She stirred her coffee. "There are so many exciting opportunities now. Younger customers, luxury markets, new partnerships." I wasn't entirely sure why she was telling me all this. Then she said something that stayed with me. Sometimes companies have to let go of the past to move forward. Her words sounded harmless, but something inside me hurt. Because I knew she wasn't talking about furniture. She was talking about people. After that lunch, I noticed small things. The company website no longer mentioned Richard and me together. Old photographs disappeared. The history section focused mostly on Michael's leadership. Company magazines featured Olivia and Michael standing in modern showrooms. Sometimes I would look through those articles and feel like a stranger. As though another woman had lived my life. I never mentioned it. Richard used to say that pride was dangerous. "Nancy," he often told me, "the work matters more than the credit." Perhaps he was right. Yet some nights I sat in my living room looking through old photo albums. There we were. Richard covered in sawdust. Me sitting on the floor drawing furniture designs. Michael asleep on blankets inside our first workshop. The company had begun with 2 people who believed in each other. Now one of them was gone, and the other one seemed forgotten. Christmas became especially difficult. Michael and Olivia hosted dinner at their beautiful house overlooking Lake Washington. Everything looked perfect. Professional decorations, expensive wine, catered food, friends I didn't know. Several times during the evening, people asked me how I knew Michael. The first time, I laughed. The second time, I smiled politely. The third time, I simply answered, "I'm his mother." People looked surprised. One woman even said, "Oh, you don't look anything like the family photos in the office." I didn't know what to say. On the drive home, I cried quietly behind the steering wheel. That night, I sat beside Richard's picture. "I don't understand what happened," I whispered. I remembered the promise we had made years earlier. No matter how successful the company became, family would always come first. But success changes people. Money changes people. Recognition changes people. And sometimes, the people you love don't realize they are drifting away until they can no longer see you standing beside them. Still, every time Michael called, my heart lifted. Every holiday, I hoped things would return to normal. Every birthday, I believed we still had time. Because mothers never truly stop waiting. They wait for phone calls. They wait for visits. They wait for apologies that may never come. And although I didn't know it then, my life was about to change in a way I never could have imagined. The phone would soon ring. My son would invite me to the most important event of his career, and I would walk into a ballroom believing I was going there as a mother. I had no idea I was walking into the moment that would break my heart in front of hundreds of strangers. People often look at successful companies and assume they were born inside glass offices with expensive furniture and men in tailored suits. That was never our story. Whitaker living began inside a garage that smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and old paint. Richard and I were both 24 years old when we decided to risk everything. He had been working at a furniture factory outside Seattle, earning barely enough to pay our bills. I worked as a bookkeeper during the day and drew furniture designs at night on our kitchen table after Michael had gone to sleep. Neither of us came from money. My father had been a mechanic. Richard's father drove delivery trucks. But Richard carried a dream that seemed much larger than our lives. "I don't want to build furniture for another man forever," he told me one evening. We sat on our front porch while Michael slept inside. "I want to build something that's ours." I looked at him. "Then let's do it." Those 4 words changed our entire lives. We borrowed against our house. We emptied our savings account. I sold several pieces of jewelry my grandmother had left me. Richard bought used woodworking equipment from a factory that had gone bankrupt. The machines were old and unreliable, but they were all we could afford. The garage became our first workshop. Richard cut wood until his hands bled. I handled invoices, suppliers, and customers. At night, after Michael went to bed, I designed tables and cabinets that I hoped people might actually buy. Sometimes we worked until 2 or 3 in the morning. There were months when we couldn't pay ourselves. Months when I feared we would lose the house. Months when we argued because stress had exhausted us both. But Richard never stopped believing. And because he believed, I believed. Michael grew up inside that workshop. He did his homework at a small desk beside the machines. He played with wood scraps while Richard worked. When he was 10 years old, he proudly told his teacher that his parents built furniture. I still remember how proud I felt. Our first major order came from a small hotel. 30 custom bedroom sets. We celebrated by buying pizza because it was all we could afford. Later came restaurants, office buildings, custom homes, little by little. Whitaker. Living grew, but very few people knew how much of the company I had built. Richard often stood in front of clients. He was charismatic, friendly, confident. People trusted him immediately. I preferred working quietly behind the scenes. I handled finances. I negotiated with suppliers. I designed several of our best-selling furniture collections. Many of our early customers dealt directly with me. Richard always said, "Nancy, is the real brain of this company." I would laugh, but secretly, those words meant everything. As Michael grew older, he became interested in the business. He studied marketing in college. Richard was thrilled. "Our son will take this company further than we ever could." And eventually, he did. Michael brought fresh ideas, new technologies, online sales, national partnerships. The company expanded rapidly. Richard and I felt proud. We never wanted to control Michael. We wanted him to succeed. Then Richard became sick. At first, we thought it was exhaustion. He had worked too hard for too many years. But after several medical tests, the doctors gave us news that changed everything. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The world suddenly became very small. Business meetings stopped mattering. Profits stopped mattering. All that mattered was time. Richard underwent treatment, chemotherapy, hospital stays, surgeries. Some days he seemed strong. Other days he could barely walk. Without hesitation, I stepped away from the company. Michael had already become president. The business was growing. I believed it was safe in his hands. My place was beside my husband for almost 3 years. I cared for Richard. I drove him to appointments, sat beside him during treatments, read books to him when he was too tired to speak. There were nights when I slept in hospital chairs. Nights when I prayed harder than I had ever prayed before. During those years, I rarely entered the office. Michael took over daily operations. Olivia entered the picture shortly afterward. She was intelligent, beautiful, ambitious. At first, I truly liked her. She had strong opinions and enormous energy. She talked about modern branding, luxury markets, corporate image, expansion. Richard admired her confidence. "She'll push Michael," he once said, and she certainly did. After their marriage, changes began happening quickly. The company logo changed. The showrooms became more modern. The advertising became more expensive. Old photographs disappeared from the office walls. The original workshop pictures vanished. Richard's dusty workbench was removed from the lobby display. Even some of my designs were renamed as new collections. At first, I assumed these changes were simply part of business growth. But one afternoon, after Richard's funeral, I visited the headquarters. The receptionist didn't recognize me. She politely asked if I had an appointment. I smiled. "No, I used to work here." While waiting, I walked through the lobby. The company history display caught my attention. Large photographs showed Michael receiving awards, Olivia attending charity events, modern stores, new products. There was one small picture of Richard. I wasn't anywhere. Not a photograph, not a mention, not even my name. For several minutes, I simply stood there. The company that Richard and I had built no longer seemed to remember me. Later that day, I mentioned it gently to Michael. "Oh, Mom, we're updating everything. It's just marketing." Marketing. The word bothered me, because memories should not be marketing. Sacrifice should not be marketing. Family should not be marketing. A few months later, I attended a charity gala where Whitaker Living sponsored an event. Several people introduced Olivia as one of the people who built the company. She accepted the compliments. She smiled. She thanked them. She never corrected them. I sat quietly at my table. I wasn't angry. At least, I tried not to be. But I began to understand something. Olivia wasn't intentionally cruel. She simply valued appearances. The company story she wanted to tell was modern, elegant, successful. An elderly widow living alone in an old house did not fit that image. One evening, I found Richard's old journal. Inside, he had written, "Never allow success to erase the people who carried you when you had nothing." I read those words several times. Then I cried, because I feared that our family was forgetting exactly where we had come from. And somewhere deep inside me, I sensed that the distance between us was growing larger every year. I just never imagined that one day, standing inside a ballroom full of strangers, I would discover how far my own family had truly drifted away. The phone rang on a rainy Tuesday morning in early October. I had been trimming the rose bushes in my backyard when I heard the sound coming from inside the house. By the time I reached the kitchen, the call had almost gone to voicemail. When I looked at the screen, my heart immediately lifted. Michael. For a brief moment, I felt exactly as I had when he was a little boy coming home from school. "Mom," he said. His voice sounded tired. "Michael, sweetheart, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. I was just wondering if you're busy." I smiled. A widow learns to treasure simple questions. "No, I'm not busy." There was a short silence. "We're having a major company event next month," he said. "The biggest project Whitaker Living has ever launched." I sat down at the kitchen table. "That sounds wonderful." "We'll have investors, media, developers. Everyone. It's a very important night." I could hear papers moving in the background, and then he said something that surprised me. "I want you to come." For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Me. After months of short conversations and canceled dinners, Michael wanted me beside him during the biggest night of his career. "Are you sure?" I finally asked. "Of course." "Mom." His voice softened. "You should see what we've built." My eyes filled with tears. For the first time in years, I felt needed. After we ended the call, I remained at the kitchen table for a long time. The house suddenly felt different, brighter. Hope can enter a lonely home very quickly. That afternoon, I took out Richard's photograph. "He invited me," I whispered. I imagined what Richard would have said, probably something simple. "See, the boy still needs his mother." For the next several weeks, I found myself thinking constantly about the event. What would I wear? Who would be there? Would Michael introduce me to everyone? Would people remember Richard? Perhaps this was the beginning of healing. Perhaps families sometimes lose their way before finding each other again. Several days later, I called Michael. "What kind of event is it?" "It's the Harbor Point project launch." I knew the name. The entire city seemed to be talking about it. Luxury residential towers, custom interiors, multi-million-dollar investments. Michael sounded proud. This could change the company forever. I'm proud of you. There was another silence. Then he quietly said, Dad would have been proud too. After we hung up, I cried. Not because I was sad, because for the first time in a very long while, Michael had mentioned his father. The following weekend, I visited the attic. Inside several old boxes, I found photographs of Richard and me during the early years of the company. One picture showed Richard standing beside our first delivery truck. Another showed me sitting at my drafting table. Then I found something unexpected. Richard's old pocket watch. It had belonged to his father. He carried it every day until his hands became too weak during his illness. Before he died, he had placed it inside my hand. Give this to Michael one day, he had said. I want him to remember where we started. For 3 years, I had kept it safely inside a wooden box. Suddenly, I knew this would be my gift. The company's biggest night. Father to son. A family memory. I had the watch professionally cleaned. The jeweler polished the silver. When I held it in my hand, I could almost hear Richard's voice. A week later, Olivia called me. That surprised me even more. Nancy, I wanted to make sure you received the invitation. Yes. Thank you. The event is very formal. I understand. There will be several major investors attending. She spoke politely, but her tone felt distant. We'll have media coverage, photographers, and business partners. I wasn't entirely sure why she was emphasizing those things. All right. She hesitated. The dress code is black tie. I looked down at my gardening clothes. Oh, I see. We want everything to look very professional. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Afterward, I felt strangely uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was simply nervousness. I opened my closet later that evening. Most of my formal clothes belonged to another time. Church dresses, funeral clothes, old dinner outfits from years ago. Richard had always loved one particular navy dress. Simple, elegant, not expensive. I had worn it to several company dinners years earlier. I had also worn it to his funeral. I carefully removed it from its garment bag. The fabric still looked beautiful. Part of me wondered if I should buy something new, but another part of me thought Richard would have wanted me to wear it. The following Sunday, I visited his grave. I often brought fresh flowers. The cemetery overlooked the water, and Richard had always loved the sound of the ocean. I sat beside his headstone. Michael invited me. The wind moved softly through the trees. I think things may finally get better. For several minutes, I simply sat there. Then I told him everything. About the company, about Michael, about Olivia, about my loneliness. Sometimes speaking to the dead feels easier than speaking to the living. Before leaving, I placed my hand against the stone. I miss you every day. As the event approached, I began noticing small changes in myself. I looked forward to mornings. I cleaned the house. I baked one of Michael's favorite apple pies, hoping to give it to him afterward. I even scheduled an appointment to have my hair trimmed. My neighbor, Carol, noticed my excitement. You look happier, My son invited me to a company event. That's wonderful. I smiled. Maybe we're finally becoming a family again. Carol squeezed my hand. You deserve that. 2 nights before the event, Michael called again. Mom, are you still coming? Of course. Good. He sounded distracted. There are going to be a lot of people. I won't get in the way. He immediately replied. You're not in the way. But his voice carried hesitation, as if something remained unsaid. I ignored it. Mothers often ignore warning signs because hope is stronger than fears. The morning of the event finally arrived. I took the pocket watch from its box. I wrapped it carefully. I laid out my navy dress. For the first time in years, I felt that perhaps I was not forgotten after all. Perhaps this evening would bring our family together. Perhaps Michael had remembered who we once were. I had no idea that another person was preparing for that same evening with a very different vision. While I dreamed about family, Olivia was planning perfection. And somewhere between those two dreams, my heart was about to break. The night of the Harbor Point launch arrived cold and clear. Seattle's skyline glittered against the dark water, and the city seemed to pulse with money, ambition, and possibility. As I drove downtown, my hands rested tightly on the steering wheel. The wrapped pocket watch sat carefully beside me. Richard's gift. His final message to our son. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready. I wore the navy dress. The same pearl earrings Richard had bought me on our 25th anniversary. A silver bracelet. Very little makeup. At 67, I had stopped trying to look younger. I simply wanted to look like myself. When I arrived at the Grand Regency Hotel, valet attendants hurried between expensive cars. Luxury sedans, black SUVs, drivers opening doors for wealthy guests. For a moment, I remained inside my own aging sedan. Suddenly, I felt out of place. Everyone around me seemed younger, richer, more polished. But then I touched the small box containing Richard's watch. I belong here, I whispered. After all, my husband and I had built the company these people had come to celebrate. Inside the hotel lobby, crystal chandeliers hung from enormous ceilings. Music played softly in the background. Staff members carried silver trays filled with champagne. The ballroom entrance displayed enormous signs. Whitaker Living, Harbor Point Launch Event, a vision for the future. The words made me smile. The future? Richard had spent his entire life building it. A young woman at the registration table looked up. Good evening. I gave her my name. Nancy Whitaker. She searched the guest list. Her expression changed slightly. One moment, please. She checked another list, then another. Finally, she found my name. Oh, yes. You're here as a guest of Mr. Whitaker. Something about the wording stung. Not Mrs. Whitaker. Not family. Simply a guest. I accepted my badge. Thank you. As I entered the ballroom, I immediately felt overwhelmed. Hundreds of people filled the room. Investors, developers, politicians, business leaders, television crews, beautiful women in elegant gowns, men in expensive tuxedos. Massive screens displayed images of luxury buildings and modern furniture. Servers moved through the crowd carrying champagne. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked expensive. And suddenly, I felt very small. I searched for Michael. I eventually spotted him near the stage. He wore a dark tuxedo. Several investors surrounded him. He looked confident, successful. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to sweep sawdust from our workshop floor. Pride filled my heart. Before I could approach him, someone touched my arm. Olivia. She looked stunning. Her silver evening gown sparkled beneath the lights. Professional makeup, perfect hair, diamond earrings. She looked exactly like the women who appeared on business magazines. Nancy. She kissed my cheek quickly. I'm so glad you made it. I wouldn't have missed it. Her eyes moved briefly over my dress. Only for a second, but I noticed. She smiled politely. You found the hotel easily. Yes. Wonderful. Someone called her name across the room. She turned immediately. We're incredibly busy tonight. Michael will come see you. Of course. Before leaving, she glanced again at my dress. You may want to stay toward the seating area until the presentations begin. I wasn't entirely sure why, but I nodded. For nearly 20 minutes, I stood alone near one side of the ballroom. People passed me constantly. Many smiled politely. Several looked at my name badge. Some appeared to recognize the Whitaker name. A few asked if I was related to Michael. I'm his mother. Most seemed surprised. One woman laughed softly. Oh my goodness, I didn't realize. Neither did I. Eventually, I found a small table and sat down. From there, I watched the room. Olivia moved gracefully between groups of investors. She introduced people. She guided conversations. She seemed completely in control. Michael remained surrounded by businessmen. I wanted to walk over, but he always appeared busy. Twice he looked in my direction. Twice, someone pulled him back into conversation. I told myself not to take it personally. This was his night. Meanwhile, I began noticing several older men and women who looked strangely familiar. One gray-haired gentleman near the bar glanced toward me several times. A woman in a dark blue dress seemed to recognize me. Another man smiled politely as he passed. Yet none of them approached. I wondered whether I had met them years earlier. The company had worked with countless people. Many faces had faded with time. About an hour after arriving, I finally reached Michael. He embraced me quickly. I'm glad you're here. His voice sounded distracted. I handed him the small wrapped box. This belonged to your father. He looked surprised. Mom, he wanted you to have it one day. For a moment, genuine emotion crossed his face. He held the box carefully. Thank you. I thought he might open it. Instead, an investor interrupted. Michael looked apologetic. I'm sorry. We'll talk later. He disappeared once again. I stood alone. The music continued. Conversations continued. And slowly, an uncomfortable feeling began growing inside me. I no longer felt like a mother attending her son's event. I felt like a visitor. At one point, I walked toward a display featuring the history of Harbor Point. Large photographs showed Michael, Olivia, architects, investors. Not one image of Richard. Not one mention of our original workshop. Nothing about the early years. Nothing about sacrifice. Nothing about where the company had begun. A young employee standing nearby began explaining the display. Mrs. Whitaker and Mr. Whitaker completely transformed the company. He pointed toward a photograph of Michael and Olivia. They basically built everything. I stared at him. He wasn't being rude. He simply didn't know. I smiled. They've certainly done wonderful work. As I walked away, I felt something inside me becoming heavier. I wasn't angry. At least, not yet. Mostly, I felt invisible. Eventually, I sat near one of the front tables. After all, Michael had invited me. Surely family belonged close to the stage. Several minutes later, I noticed Olivia speaking quietly with one of the event coordinators. Both women looked toward me. Then they looked away. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Nearby, the gray-haired gentleman I had noticed earlier continued watching me. Our eyes met briefly. He looked almost shocked, as if he couldn't believe I was there. Across the room, another older woman also stared at me. Neither approached. Neither spoke. The lights in the ballroom slowly dimmed. The presentation would begin soon. Guests moved toward their assigned tables. Investors took their seats. Michael prepared backstage. Olivia continued organizing everything, and I sat quietly holding my purse, completely unaware that within the next hour, my life would change forever. Because while I still believed I was sitting where I belonged, someone else had already decided that I did not belong there at all. The ballroom lights dimmed as the evening presentation prepared to begin. Soft music faded into silence. Guests moved toward their assigned tables while servers quietly removed empty glasses. The giant screens beside the stage displayed architectural renderings of Harbor Point. I remained seated at the front table. Michael had invited me. I never questioned whether I belonged there. A small card sat beside my plate. Guest, no family designation, no special title. Just one simple word, for reasons I couldn't explain. That small white card suddenly made me feel very old. Across the room, Olivia continued directing employees. She moved with confidence, speaking to event coordinators, photographers, and investors. Several people stopped to compliment her. "You've done an incredible job. The event looks spectacular." She smiled graciously each time. The woman standing beside me quietly said, "Your daughter is beautiful." I smiled politely. "My daughter-in-law." The woman nodded. "They make a powerful couple." I looked toward Michael and Olivia standing near the stage. They certainly did. Successful, elegant, important. For a brief moment, I wondered whether Richard would have recognized this version of our company. The answer frightened me. Perhaps not. Several minutes later, Olivia walked toward my table. At first, I thought she had finally come to sit beside me. Instead, she stopped next to my chair. Her smile looked professional, but her eyes seemed tense. "Nancy, May I speak with you for a moment? Of course. I stood. She guided me several steps away from the table. Her voice lowered. I think there may have been a misunderstanding regarding the seating. I looked at her. What do you mean? This section is reserved for lead investors and executive guests. I glanced at the table. I assumed Michael wanted me here. She folded her hands. There are some available seats farther back. For several seconds, I didn't understand. You want me to move? It's only for the presentation. I looked toward the rear of the ballroom. The tables were much farther from the stage. Many guests there appeared to be employees or secondary attendees. But Michael invited me. Olivia smiled again. A thinner smile. I know. It's just a matter of appearances. That word. Appearances. The same word hidden inside so many conversations. I felt heat rising into my face. I don't understand. She lowered her voice even further. There are several major investors here tonight. I looked down at my dress. Suddenly, I understood. Or at least, I thought I did. You don't want me sitting here. Her expression changed. Nancy, please don't make this difficult. Difficult. Several nearby guests had begun watching us. Olivia noticed. Her voice became tighter. This event has taken months to organize. I realize that. We're trying to present a certain image. The words struck me harder than she probably intended. A certain image. I looked at my navy dress, my old shoes, my silver bracelet. For the first time all evening, I felt embarrassed by how I looked. I wore the nicest dress I own. She sighed. That's not what I mean. But I knew exactly what she meant. At that moment, Michael appeared beside us. Everything okay? Relief flooded through me. Surely he would solve this misunderstanding. Olivia immediately answered. We're just sorting out seating. Michael looked briefly at the front table, then at me, then at Olivia. He seemed uncomfortable. I thought Mom was sitting with us. Olivia kept her voice calm. The investor table is full. Michael glanced around. Several seats remained empty. I saw him notice them. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than anything. I waited. One sentence. One simple sentence. My mother stays. Instead, he rubbed his forehead. Maybe just for the presentation. I stared at him. You want me to move? His eyes avoided mine. Just temporarily. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was my son, the little boy I had carried when he was sick, the young man whose college tuition Richard and I had struggled to pay, the child who once slept beside my hospital bed when I had pneumonia, and now he couldn't look me in the eye. I tried to remain calm. Michael, your father and I built this company. He looked exhausted. I know. Mom. Then why am I being asked to leave my seat? Several people nearby had become silent. Conversations stopped. Olivia looked increasingly nervous. Nancy, please. No. The words surprised even me. I had spent years remaining quiet, years avoiding conflict, years accepting disappointment. But suddenly, I felt Richard standing beside me. I felt every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every unpaid bill. every hospital visit, every year of my life. I will stay where my son invited me to sit. Olivia's face hardened. For the first time all evening, the polite mask disappeared. You are creating a scene. I stared at her. No, Olivia. I think you're creating one. A nearby investor looked toward us. Someone else stopped speaking. The room had become noticeably quieter. Olivia stepped closer. I need this evening to go perfectly. So do I. Her jaw tightened. Nancy, these people don't understand. What don't they understand? She hesitated. I could see her deciding whether to say the truth. And then she did. They don't understand who you are. The words landed like a slap. I looked directly into her eyes. I'm Michael's mother. She shook her head slightly. That's not what I mean. But again, I knew exactly what she meant. To her, I looked like an elderly widow, an old woman in an outdated dress, someone who belonged in family photographs, but not beside investors. Someone who reminded people of the past. Someone who did not fit the image. My voice trembled. Richard would be ashamed of this. Michael finally spoke. Mom, please. Please, what? Let's not do this tonight. The pain inside me became something sharp, something I had never felt before. Because in that moment, I realized Michael wasn't choosing between his wife and his mother. He was choosing between his image and his mother. And I was losing. Olivia turned toward one of the event staff members. Can you find security? Please. I thought I had misunderstood. Surely not. Surely she wouldn't. The young employee looked uncertain. Security. Olivia never took her eyes off me. Yes. Michael looked shocked. Olivia, she interrupted him. We cannot have a disturbance in front of investors. The employee hurried away. My entire body became cold. Several guests openly watched us now. No one spoke. No one moved. I looked at my son. This was his moment. His decision. His mother. His wife. His family. He could stop everything with one sentence. He said nothing. 2 security guards appeared at the far side of the ballroom. Large men in dark suits. Walking toward us, I suddenly became aware of every wrinkle on my hands, every gray hair, every year. Humiliation flooded through me. Not because strangers were watching, but because my own son was. I reached down and picked up my purse. My fingers trembled. The wrapped pocket watch remained inside. Richard's gift, still unopened, still unseen. My eyes filled with tears. I would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. I looked one final time at Michael. He looked devastated. But he remained silent, and the security guards kept walking toward me. The 2 security guards continued walking toward me. The music had already stopped. The ballroom had become so quiet that I could hear the clicking of women's heels against the marble floor and the soft hum of the air conditioning above us. Nearly 300 people were watching. Some pretended not to. Others stared openly. I had spent 67 years learning how to remain composed. I had survived financial struggles, business failures, my husband's illness, and his death. But nothing had prepared me for standing in a room full of strangers while my own son watched me being removed. The taller guard stopped several feet away. His expression was polite. "Ma'am?" He seemed uncomfortable. I couldn't blame him. He was simply doing his job. I held my purse tightly against my chest. For a moment, I considered arguing, explaining, telling everyone exactly who I was, telling them that the company they admired had started in my garage, that my husband and I had risked everything, that my fingerprints still existed on hundreds of original designs. But suddenly, I felt tired. Very tired. There comes a moment in some people's lives when they realize they no longer wish to fight. Not because they are weak, because they are wounded. I looked at the security guard. "It's all right." My voice barely came out. "I'll leave." The words caused pain the moment I spoke them. Across from me, Olivia released a quiet breath. Relief. That hurt. Because she wasn't relieved that conflict had ended. She was relieved that I was disappearing. Michael still hadn't moved. I looked directly at him. His eyes were full of guilt. But guilt is not the same as courage. The guard spoke gently. "Would you like me to help you?" "No, thank you." I reached for my coat. My hands trembled as I picked up my purse. The small wrapped box containing Richard's pocket watch slid slightly inside. The gift suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Richard had trusted me. He had asked me to give this watch to our son. Yet at that moment, I couldn't imagine placing it in Michael's hands. Not tonight. Not after this. As I prepared to walk away, memories began flooding my mind. Michael at 5 years old, his first bicycle, his first day of school, the time he broke his arm falling from a tree, the night he cried because children at school had teased him, Richard and I sitting beside his bed, promising him that family would always protect him. I remembered his college graduation, the tears in Richard's eyes, the pride we both felt. I remembered helping him move into his first apartment. I remembered paying bills we couldn't afford. I remembered selling jewelry so he could attend business school. And now I stood before him like a stranger. How had we arrived here? What road had carried us so far apart? I looked toward Olivia. She stood perfectly still. Her shoulders remained straight. Her face calm. But beneath that calm, I sensed fear. Not fear of me. Fear of embarrassment. Fear that the investors might think less of her. Fear that an elderly woman in an old navy dress would damage the image she had worked so hard to create. Perhaps she truly believed she was protecting the company. But companies cannot survive when they forget their own foundations. I took one step, then another. The security guards moved beside me, not touching me, simply accompanying me. And with every step, the humiliation grew heavier. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others whispered. One woman looked genuinely upset. A young employee appeared close to tears. Nobody intervened. Nobody spoke. Success often teaches people to remain silent when speaking carries risk. As we walked, I noticed the giant screens behind the stage. Images of Harbor Point rotated slowly. Luxury, prestige, vision, future. Beautiful words, but none of them meant anything to me anymore. Because what good is success if it teaches a son to abandon his mother halfway across the ballroom? I heard Michael's voice. "Mom?" I stopped. For one brief second, hope returned. Perhaps he had finally found his courage. I turned. He stood several feet away. His face looked pale. People watched him. Investors, employees, his wife. The entire room waited. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came. His silence broke my heart more completely than anything Olivia had said. Because Olivia had never promised to love me. Michael had. Not in words. In all the years of being my son. I gave him a small smile. The kind mothers give when they are trying to protect their children from guilt. It's okay. But it wasn't. Nothing about this was okay. I resumed walking. Each step felt heavier than the one before. I reached the edge of the ballroom. The hotel doors stood only 20 feet away. Outside, I could see the city lights through the glass. Rain had begun falling. Seattle rain. Soft, cold, lonely. I imagined driving home, entering my empty house, taking off my dress, placing Richard's watch back into its box, sitting alone at the kitchen table, and perhaps, for the first time, accepting that my family no longer needed me. Maybe old age was simply this, watching yourself disappear. I suddenly remembered something Richard had once said during his illness. He had been very weak. We were sitting together near the hospital window. Nancy. Yes. If people ever forget who you are, don't forget yourself. At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now his words returned. Don't forget yourself. I straightened my shoulders slightly. I wasn't simply an elderly woman leaving a party. I was Nancy Whitaker. I had built a company. I had raised a son. I had loved one man for 42 years. I had survived grief. I had survived loss. And I would survive this too. The security guard quietly opened the ballroom door. Ma'am? I nodded. Thank you. Behind me, I heard whispers spreading through the room. Something had changed. I couldn't explain it. A strange tension suddenly moved through the crowd. Several chairs shifted. Someone spoke loudly. Another voice answered. I turned slightly. At one of the investor tables, an older gentleman with silver hair had risen to his feet. He stared directly at me. His face showed disbelief, shock, and something else. Recognition. Several other guests at nearby tables were now looking not at Olivia, not at Michael, but at me. The gray-haired man spoke. His voice carried across the silent ballroom. Excuse me. Everyone froze. The security guards stopped moving. Olivia turned. Michael looked confused. The man slowly placed his glass on the table. He continued staring at me, and then he said the words that would change everything. Did you just ask Nancy Whitaker to leave? The entire ballroom froze. The older gentleman remained standing beside his table, one hand resting against the back of his chair. His silver hair reflected the soft light from the chandeliers, and his expression showed something very close to disbelief. "Did you just ask Nancy Whitaker to leave?" Nobody answered. Even the two security guards stopped moving. Olivia looked confused. Michael appeared stunned. The man slowly stepped away from his chair. For several seconds, he continued looking at me, as if he were trying to confirm that I was truly standing there. Then his face softened. "Nancy?" I recognized him at the same moment. Edward Sullivan. 20 years older, more gray hair, but the same eyes, the same calm voice. The same man who had once sat at our kitchen table while Richard and I tried to help him save his failing company. My breath caught. "Edward." A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom. Several guests turned toward him. Everyone knew who he was. Edward Sullivan was one of the largest investors in Seattle real estate. Newspapers often wrote about him. His companies owned hotels, commercial buildings, and luxury developments throughout the Pacific Northwest. He slowly walked toward me, not toward Michael, not toward Olivia, toward me. "Nancy Whitaker." His voice became emotional. "I can't believe it's really you." The security guards immediately stepped aside. Edward reached me and gently took both of my hands. The entire ballroom watched. "Are you all right?" For a moment, I couldn't answer. I simply nodded. He looked toward Olivia. "Why is security escorting Mrs. Whitaker out?" Olivia swallowed. "There seems to have been some confusion." Edward's eyes narrowed. "What kind of confusion?" Michael stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan, it's a family matter." Edward looked directly at him. "No, Michael. It stopped being a family matter the moment your mother was publicly humiliated." The room became even quieter. I had never heard Edward speak harshly before. 25 years earlier, Richard and I had met him when his first construction company was collapsing. He had been close to bankruptcy. Banks refused to help him. Richard trusted him. So did I. We had extended payment deadlines, introduced him to suppliers, given him time. Years later, he succeeded. Apparently, he had never forgotten. Another chair scraped against the floor. A woman stood. Margaret Ellis, one of the region's most respected investors. She stared at me in disbelief. "Nancy." I turned toward her. My eyes widened. Margaret had once been a young business owner who had visited our original workshop seeking advice. Richard and I had spent countless evenings helping her understand finances and contracts. She walked toward us. "Oh my goodness." She embraced me tightly. Several people in this ballroom looked completely confused. Olivia stood motionless. Michael looked as though he no longer understood his own event. A third voice suddenly spoke. "Is that really Nancy Whitaker?" Thomas Grant rose from another table. Years ago, Thomas had nearly lost his furniture company during a recession. Richard and I had helped him negotiate loans. He crossed the ballroom. Then another person stood. Robert Hayes. Then another. William Carter. One by one, influential investors began leaving their tables. The room that had moments earlier watched me leave now watched powerful people walk toward me. I felt overwhelmed. The security guards quietly stepped farther away. No one needed them anymore. Edward turned toward the crowd. Does everyone here understand who this woman is? Nobody answered. Olivia looked pale. Michael remained silent. Edward's voice grew stronger. 22 years ago, when my company was collapsing, Nancy Whitaker and her husband gave me more time to pay my debts when every bank had already turned me away. He looked directly at me. You saved my business. I shook my head. No. Edward. Yes. His voice became firm. You did. Margaret stepped beside him. When I started my first company, Nancy spent weeks helping me understand financial statements. She smiled through tears. You refused to charge me a single dollar. Thomas nodded. Richard and Nancy helped dozens of us. More whispers spread through the crowd. Several investors now looked at me differently. Not as an elderly woman, not as an unwanted guest. As someone they suddenly realized they should know. Olivia finally spoke. I wasn't aware, Edward interrupted her. Clearly. His voice was not cruel, but it was sharp. He turned toward the security guards. Gentlemen, you can leave. They looked toward hotel management. One of the managers immediately nodded. The guards quietly stepped away. For several moments, nobody moved. Then something happened that I never could have imagined. Edward pulled out his chair. He looked at me. Mrs. Whitaker, please sit. I shook my head. Edward, this is your table? He smiled. No. He looked around the room. This table exists because of people like you. Margaret sat beside me. Thomas remained standing nearby. Robert Hayes joined them. The entire front section had suddenly transformed. Several younger investors whispered to one another. Who is she? How do they know her? Why are they treating her this way? Michael finally spoke. Mom. I looked at him. For the first time all evening, he appeared frightened. Not because of money, not because of investors, because he realized that the people whose respect he desperately wanted had suddenly chosen his mother. Edward turned toward Michael. Did you know your mother was being removed? Michael lowered his eyes. He couldn't finish. The silence answered for him. Margaret looked genuinely disappointed. Richard would be heartbroken. Those words hit Michael harder than anything else. Olivia attempted to recover control. There has been a misunderstanding. Edward looked directly at her. What misunderstanding? She struggled to answer. I didn't realize who she was. His expression changed. The entire ballroom seemed to lean forward. And then Edward said the sentence that would stay with everyone in that room forever. That's exactly the problem. He glanced around at the guests. You looked at her clothes instead of her life. Nobody spoke, because everyone knew he was right. I sat quietly holding my purse. Inside it remained Richard's pocket watch. Unopened. Unseen. For the first time all evening, I no longer felt invisible, but I also felt something else. Sadness. Because it had taken strangers to defend me while my own son remained silent. Edward gently touched my shoulder. Nancy, there are many people in this room who owe you more than they can ever repay. Tears filled my eyes. I never expected any of this. I know. He smiled softly. That's why people never forgot. Across the ballroom, I noticed several investors standing. Not one, not two, nearly an entire section. Some nodded toward me, others smiled. And in that moment, the power inside the room shifted completely. The woman who had been seconds away from being escorted into the rain had suddenly become the person everyone wanted to know. But the greatest surprise had not yet come, because Edward Sullivan had only revealed the beginning. The real story of Nancy Whitaker was still hidden, and soon, the entire ballroom would learn exactly who had helped build the empire they had gathered to celebrate. For several long seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. The massive screens behind the stage continued displaying images of Harbor Point, but nobody looked at them anymore. Every eye in the room had turned toward me. Nancy Whitaker, the woman who had nearly been escorted out only minutes earlier. Edward Sullivan remained standing beside my chair. Margaret Ellis sat quietly at my side. Thomas Grant and Robert Hayes stood nearby. Around us, conversations had completely stopped. Olivia looked as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Michael still stood several yards away, unable to understand how his mother had suddenly become the center of the room. Edward slowly turned toward the crowd. I think some people here deserve to know exactly who Nancy Whitaker is. His voice carried easily through the ballroom. No one interrupted him. 20 years earlier, Edward had nearly lost everything. His first development company had collapsed during a recession. Banks refused additional loans. Suppliers demanded payment. Investors disappeared. He looked at me. You remember that winter? I nodded slowly. How could I forget? Edward continued. I walked into the Whitaker workshop because I needed 60 more days to survive. Several people listened carefully. I expected them to refuse me. He looked toward Michael. Your father and mother had every reason to say no. He smiled softly. But Nancy made coffee, sat at a small wooden table, and spent 3 hours going through my financial records. I lowered my eyes. I remembered that day. Edward had looked exhausted, defeated. Richard had believed he was honest. I had believed he deserved another chance. Edward's voice became emotional. Your mother convinced your father to extend payment terms even though their own company was struggling. Several investors exchanged surprised looks. He continued, That decision saved my company. The ballroom remained silent. Edward pointed toward himself. Everything I own today began because Nancy Whitaker chose compassion over profit. I immediately shook my head. Edward, Richard made that decision too. He smiled. Yes, but he told me later that you were the one who refused to give up on me. My eyes filled with tears. Richard, even now, he was somehow present. Margaret Ellis spoke next. When I opened my first design company, I had no experience with business contracts. She laughed softly. I was 29 and terrified. Several people smiled. I visited Whitaker Living because I wanted to ask Richard for advice. She looked directly at me. Nancy spent every Saturday for almost 2 months teaching me bookkeeping. I had completely forgotten. Margaret continued. She never accepted payment. Thomas Grant stepped forward. My company nearly went bankrupt during the recession of 2008. He folded his arms. Most suppliers demanded immediate payment. He looked at Michael. Your parents gave me 6 extra months. Another investor nodded. So did ours. A woman near the back suddenly raised her hand. Nancy helped my husband. I turned in surprise. I barely recognized her. Years ago, her husband had owned a small manufacturing company. Richard and I had met them at a business conference. One memory after another began filling the room. People spoke. Stories emerged. Names returned. A businessman whose factory survived. A designer who received advice. A young couple who received their first contract. Several people had never met one another before that evening, yet somehow they all shared one connection. Me, or rather, the woman I had once been, the woman I had almost forgotten myself. Olivia looked completely overwhelmed. She quietly approached Michael. I saw her whisper something. He shook his head. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed in control. Edward eventually turned back toward the audience. Many people in this room know me. Nobody disagreed. But very few know that one of the most important business lessons I ever learned came from Nancy Whitaker. He looked at me. You once told me that businesses survive because people trust people. I smiled weakly. That sounds like something Richard would say. No. Edward shook his head. That was you. Laughter softly spread through the room. But the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a corporate event. It had become something deeply personal. Several younger investors looked confused. One man quietly asked, Were you part of Whitaker Living? Before I could answer, Margaret spoke. Part of it? She looked genuinely shocked. Nancy Whitaker helped build it. Another older businessman nodded. The original accounting systems were hers. Many of the early product lines were her designs. She negotiated supplier contracts. She handled financing. One sentence after another landed inside the ballroom. I noticed Michael listening carefully. His face had changed, not because he doubted these stories, because he had never heard many of them. During his childhood, Richard and I had protected him from financial struggles. We never wanted him to worry. Perhaps we had hidden too much. Perhaps he had only seen his father standing in front of customers. Perhaps he had never fully understood how much work happened quietly behind the scenes. Edward looked toward Michael. Did your mother ever tell you any of this? Michael slowly shook his head. No, I answered quietly. There never seemed to be a reason. Edward looked surprised. There was every reason. I lowered my eyes. Perhaps he was right. After Richard became ill, I had gradually disappeared from the company. I assumed it was temporary. Then years passed. New leadership arrived. New stories replaced old ones. Eventually, I became invisible. Not because anyone officially erased me, because I allowed myself to step aside. Olivia finally spoke. Her voice sounded fragile. Nancy, I truly didn't know. I looked at her. For the first time since the evening began, she no longer appeared confident. She appeared frightened and perhaps embarrassed. I believed her. She genuinely hadn't known. Because Michael had never told her. Because the company had stopped telling our story. Because photographs disappeared. because names vanished, because success often rewrites history. Edward glanced toward the stage. It's interesting. Everyone looked at him. The Harbor Point presentation celebrates vision, leadership, and legacy. He paused. And yet the woman who taught many of us those values was being escorted out of the room. No one answered. Because no one could. Michael finally walked toward me. His face looked pale. Mom. I looked at him. There were tears in his eyes. Real tears. When did all of this happen? I smiled sadly. Many years ago. Why didn't you tell me? I hesitated. Because mothers often do not keep score. Because Richard and I had always believed that love should be given freely. Because I never imagined that one day I would need proof of my own life. I didn't think it mattered. Edward immediately responded. It matters. Several people nodded. Margaret reached for my hand. It always mattered. At that moment, I suddenly felt Richard beside me. Not physically, but emotionally, as if he were standing somewhere in the room, quietly watching. Because Richard had always believed that kindness returned eventually. Maybe not immediately, maybe not even within years, but eventually. And now, after decades, those quiet acts of kindness had returned all at once. Yet the greatest revelation had not arrived. Because several of the investors standing before me knew something that even Michael did not. Something Richard had protected. Something buried inside old legal documents and forgotten agreements. And before the night ended, my son would discover that his mother was not only part of the company's past, she was still part of its future. The ballroom had changed completely. Only 30 minutes earlier, guests had been discussing investments, construction schedules, and projected profits. Now nobody seemed interested in Harbor Point anymore. Every conversation centered on one question. Who was Nancy Whitaker? I sat quietly beside Margaret Ellis, while Edward Sullivan remained standing near my chair. Michael had not returned to the stage. Olivia stood beside him, both of them looking overwhelmed. The evening they had spent months preparing no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the past. It belonged to Richard. And somehow, it belonged to me. Several younger investors began approaching our table. One man introduced himself. Mrs. Whitaker. I had no idea you were one of the founders. I smiled gently. I was simply Richard's partner. Edward immediately disagreed. You were much more than that. Another guest asked. Why isn't your name in the company history? I looked toward Michael. He lowered his eyes. The truth was not simple. No single person had removed me. No official meeting had erased my name. Life had simply continued. Richard became sick. I stepped away. New leadership arrived. Old stories disappeared. But before I could answer, a familiar voice spoke from behind us. Nancy! I turned. Standing several feet away was James Holloway. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. James had been Richard's attorney for nearly 30 years. He had handled contracts, partnership agreements, and estate planning. He was now 75 years old, retired, and apparently one of the invited guests. James. He smiled warmly. I've been sitting in the back watching all of this. He looked toward Michael. I think perhaps it's time certain things were discussed. Michael frowned. What things? James studied him carefully. Your father's documents. The room became quiet again. Michael looked confused. What documents? James adjusted his glasses. Richard believed that someday this conversation would become necessary. I felt my stomach tighten, because suddenly I remembered. Years earlier, during Richard's illness, he had asked James to visit our house. The two men spent hours in his office. Afterward, Richard had simply told me, everything is protected. At the time, I had not asked questions. The company already belonged to Michael, or at least I thought it did. James slowly sat beside us. Nancy, do you remember the meeting in your dining room? I nodded. Yes. Michael looked back and forth between us. What meeting? James folded his hands. Your father updated several legal documents before his death. Olivia suddenly spoke. What kind of documents? James looked directly at her. Ownership agreements, voting rights, succession protections. Several investors nearby became very interested. Michael's expression changed. Dad never mentioned any of that. James nodded. He intended to. I felt my heart beating faster. Richard had never hidden things from us. So why had he never explained this? James reached into his briefcase. I don't usually carry these documents. He smiled slightly. But your father asked me years ago to attend important company events whenever possible. He removed a large envelope. I stared at it. The handwriting on the front belonged to Richard. For Michael. My son looked pale. You have letters from Dad. Only one. James carefully placed the envelope on the table. The room had become so quiet that nearby conversations had completely stopped. Edward looked toward James. Should this wait? James slowly shook his head. I don't think Richard would want it to. Michael carefully picked up the envelope. His hands trembled. Before opening it, James spoke again. Your father was very concerned during his illness. I looked at him. He worried that Nancy would eventually disappear from the company she helped create. Tears immediately filled my eyes. Richard. Even during his final months, he had worried about me. James continued. He wanted to make certain that could never happen completely. Michael looked confused. What does that mean? James opened the folder. Several legal papers appeared. He adjusted his glasses. Whitaker Living was originally established with two founding partners. He looked directly at Michael. Richard Whitaker and Nancy Whitaker. A few people nodded. That much was already known. But James continued. Although operational control eventually transferred to Michael Whitaker, your parents retained certain founder protections. Michael frowned. What kind of protections? James answered quietly. Voting rights on major company changes. The silence became almost unbearable. Olivia stared. That's impossible. James calmly looked at her. No, it's legal. Michael seemed shocked. I've been CEO for years. Yes. You handled ownership transfers. Correct. Then why didn't I know this? James hesitated. Because your father believed some things should only be explained if they became necessary. Edward slowly folded his arms. And perhaps tonight became necessary. I could barely breathe. I had completely forgotten those meetings. Richard had once asked me to sign several papers. I trusted him. He said only, "One day, this may protect you." I never imagined such a day would arrive. Michael looked at me. "Mom, did you know?" I answered honestly, "Not completely." James nodded. Richard never wanted Nancy to use her position. He turned toward the room. She never attended board meetings after his illness. She never exercised any authority. Margaret quietly said, "That sounds exactly like Nancy." James smiled. Richard believed that if his family remained united, none of this would ever matter. He looked directly at Michael. But he feared that success might eventually make people forget where the company came from. Those words hit everyone, especially Michael. He sat down heavily. His face looked devastated. Olivia spoke softly. "So Nancy still has influence over the company," James answered carefully. "She remains a founding partner under several agreements." Several investors exchanged glances. This information changed everything. Not because I wanted power. I didn't. But because the woman who had been removed from the investor table was not simply an elderly relative, I was legally connected to the company itself. The irony was almost unbearable. I looked toward Michael. "I never wanted any of this." He looked at me. "I know." And for the first time that evening, I believed he truly did. James then removed one final item from the folder. A sealed letter. Richard's handwriting covered the front. He handed it to Michael. "Your father asked me to give you this if the family ever lost sight of each other." Michael stared at the envelope. His hands shook. The ballroom remained completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because everyone understood. The documents mattered. The ownership mattered. The legal protections mattered. But the letter mattered most. Somewhere inside that envelope were Richard's final words. Words written by a dying husband. Words written by a father. Words written by a man who apparently saw this night coming long before any of us did. And as Michael slowly looked down at his father's handwriting, I realized that the most painful part of the evening was still waiting for us. Michael held his father's letter in both hands. The envelope remained unopened. No one in the ballroom seemed willing to breathe. The Harbor Point presentation had completely collapsed. The giant screens still displayed images of luxury towers, but the audience no longer cared about architecture, profits, or investments. Everyone was watching one family slowly unravel. James Holloway quietly gathered the legal papers and placed them back into his briefcase. The documents had already done their work. The truth was no longer hidden. I was not simply Michael's mother. I was not merely Richard's widow. I was one of the people who had built Whitaker Living. But strangely, that revelation did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel sad. Because none of it should have required legal papers. None of it should have required investors defending me. My own son should have remembered. Michael finally looked at me. "Mom, I honestly didn't know." His voice sounded broken. I nodded gently. "I believe you." Olivia stood beside him. her hands trembling slightly. For the first time all evening, her confidence had completely disappeared. Several investors had quietly returned to their seats, but nobody had resumed normal conversations. Edward Sullivan remained standing. Margaret sat beside me. Thomas Grant folded his arms. The atmosphere had changed from celebration to judgment. One investor finally spoke. "Michael, did you really allow security to remove your mother?" No one answered. Another voice came from the back. "And one of the founders." A third person added quietly, "This doesn't look good." The words were not cruel. They were factual. Michael ran his hand across his face. "I made a mistake." Edward looked at him carefully. "No, Michael." The older man spoke softly. "You made several." The room became quiet again. Edward continued. "You forgot who built your foundation." Michael lowered his eyes. "I know." "No." Edward shook his head. "You know now?" Those words landed heavily, because they were true. Many of the investors present had built businesses themselves. They understood sacrifice. They understood founders. They understood the people who work quietly behind success. One elderly businessman stood. "I worked with Richard for nearly 15 years. He looked toward Michael. "Your father talked about your mother constantly." Several people nodded. "He called her his partner, his compass, the person who kept him grounded." I felt tears forming again. Richard had always been generous with his praise, even when I didn't deserve it. Olivia finally stepped forward. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Nancy, I am so sorry." Everyone looked at her. She took a breath. "I truly didn't know your history with the company." I looked at her carefully. For the first time, I saw something different. Not arrogance, not ambition, fear, regret. "I believed this was a business event," I answered quietly. "It is." She shook her head. "No." Her eyes filled with tears. "I turned it into one." Michael looked at her. Neither of them seemed able to find the right words. Perhaps there were no right words. One investor near the stage suddenly spoke. "Our firms value leadership." Several heads turned. He continued. "We also value character." Another investor nodded. "Family values matter." A third person added, "Especially in a family company." The room was no longer criticizing Michael's business decisions. They were questioning his judgment. And that frightened him. Because investors can forgive financial losses. They do not easily forgive character failures. Michael finally sat down. His shoulders collapsed. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a CEO and more like the exhausted little boy I used to comfort after difficult days. "I don't know how this happened." No one answered immediately. Then James spoke. "It happened slowly." Everyone turned toward him. "It usually does." He looked around the room. "Families don't break in one night." His eyes settled on Michael. "They drift." Michael stared at the unopened letter. "Dad saw this coming." James nodded. "Yes." The answer shocked everyone. including me. He worried that success might become more important than gratitude. Michael looked devastated. He told you that. He told me many things. James removed his glasses. He loved you deeply. Tears rolled down Michael's face. The entire ballroom remained silent. Nobody seemed uncomfortable anymore. People simply watched. Watched a son beginning to understand what he had lost. Olivia suddenly sat beside him. For the first time all evening, she stopped acting like an executive. She looked like a frightened wife. I never wanted to hurt her. Her voice trembled. Michael didn't answer, because both of them knew that intention no longer mattered. The damage had already happened. One of the younger investors quietly approached Edward. He whispered something. Edward nodded. Then he looked toward Michael. You should understand something. Michael raised his eyes. There are people in this room considering whether they still wish to invest. The words hit the entire ballroom. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Olivia looked shocked. What? Edward remained calm. Business is trust. He glanced toward me. Your parents taught many of us that. Another investor stood. If the founders of a company can be treated this way, people ask questions. More silence. Michael looked pale. You're saying investors may leave? No, Edward answered honestly. I'm saying people are disappointed, Margaret added softly. Deeply disappointed. The Harbor Point project suddenly felt fragile. Months of planning, years of work, millions of dollars, all threatened because of one evening, one decision, one act of humiliation. And strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt exhausted. I looked around the room. People who had once needed Richard and me. People who remembered our kindness. People defending me. And yet all I wanted was to go home. I reached into my purse. The small wrapped box remained there. Richard's pocket watch. I held it in my hands. Michael saw it. What is that? I looked down. Your father's watch. His face changed. He wanted you to have it. The room became quiet again. I held the box carefully. But I don't know if tonight is the right time. Michael suddenly began crying. Real tears. Not embarrassment, not fear, grief. Because at that moment, he finally understood something. His father had trusted him. His mother had trusted him. And he had failed them both. James gently pointed toward the envelope. Michael. My son looked up. Read your father's letter. Michael stared at the handwriting. His hands trembled violently now. Across the ballroom. Nobody moved. The investors waited. Olivia waited. I waited. Because somehow everyone understood that Richard Whitaker had entered the room. Not physically, but through those words, and whatever he had written would change the rest of the evening. Perhaps the rest of our lives. Michael slowly broke the seal, and as he unfolded the paper, tears were already falling onto his father's handwriting. Michael stared at the letter for several long seconds. The paper trembled in his hands. No one in the ballroom spoke. The investors who had come to discuss millions of dollars now sat quietly, waiting for the words of a man who had been dead for 3 years. Richard Whitaker had somehow entered the room, not through photographs, not through company history, but through a letter written during the final months of his life. Michael swallowed hard. His voice shook as he began to read. "My son, if you are reading this letter, then something has gone wrong inside our family." The silence deepened. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving. Michael continued. "Your mother and I built our company together, but we built our family first. The company was only wood, machines, invoices, and buildings. Family was always the real success." My eyes filled immediately. I could hear Richard's voice inside every sentence. Slow, steady, gentle. Michael paused. He wiped his eyes. Olivia sat beside him, crying quietly. He read again. "Your mother sacrificed more than anyone will ever understand. She gave up opportunities, sleep, dreams, and years of her life so our family could stand." Several investors lowered their heads. Margaret reached for my hand. I squeezed hers. Richard continued speaking through his words. "If you ever become successful enough to forget your mother, then you have become poorer than when we started." Michael's voice broke. He could barely continue. The ballroom had become something entirely different now. Not a business event. Not a company launch. It had become a funeral delayed by 3 years. A husband speaking to his wife. A father speaking to his son. Michael took a deep breath. "Money impresses strangers. Character protects family." Edward Sullivan quietly nodded. Several people wiped away tears. Richard had never been an educated writer. He had spoken plainly. But sometimes simple truths cut the deepest. Michael continued. "If one day your mother stands alone, then stand beside her. If one day she becomes forgotten, remind people who she is. If one day she feels unwanted, bring her home." At that point, Michael could no longer read. He lowered the letter. His shoulders shook. For several moments, nobody moved. Then James gently said, "Finish it." Michael nodded. With trembling hands, he looked down again. "Nancy has spent her life protecting the people she loves. Please do not make her spend her final years feeling invisible. One day you will understand how quickly time disappears. And when that day comes, I hope you remember that your mother was the greatest gift God ever gave our family." My tears finally fell. I had spent 3 years missing Richard. 3 years speaking to his photograph. 3 years sitting alone in our house. And suddenly he was with me again. The final paragraph remained. Michael's voice became almost a whisper. "Take care of each other. Protect your mother. Remember where you came from. Love matters longer than success. Dad." The room remained completely silent. No applause. No movement. Only tears. Michael folded the letter carefully. Then he stood. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Finally, he looked at me. "Mom." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." I saw the little boy again, not the CEO, not the businessman. "My son, I'm so sorry." The pain inside him was obvious, because grief had arrived all at once. Not simply grief for Richard, grief for lost years, for missed visits, for forgotten conversations, for all the times he chose work over family. He walked slowly toward me. Every person in the ballroom watched. He stopped beside my chair. I failed him. I shook my head. "No." Tears rolled down his face. "I failed you." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Michael dropped to his knees. Gasps spread through the room. He looked up at me. "I don't know when I changed." His voice trembled. "I don't know when I became someone Dad wouldn't recognize." My heart broke, because this wasn't the confident executive everyone knew. This was simply my son. The same boy who once cried after losing baseball games. The same child who came into our bedroom after nightmares. I touched his face. "You are still my son." He closed his eyes. "I let this happen." He looked toward Olivia. "I stood there." His voice became quieter. "I watched them remove you." That truth hurt both of us. Because it was true. Olivia suddenly stood. She walked toward me slowly. The entire room watched her. The powerful woman who had controlled the evening was gone. Only a frightened daughter-in-law remained. She stopped several feet away. Tears had ruined her makeup. Her hands shook. "Nancy." She struggled to continue. "I thought I understood this company." She looked around the ballroom. "I thought I understood success." She looked at Michael. "I thought appearances mattered." Her voice broke. "But I was wrong." She began crying openly. "I judged you." No one interrupted. "I saw your dress." She wiped her eyes. "I saw your age." She looked down. "I never stopped to see your life." The room remained silent, because everyone knew that confession required courage. She looked at me again. "I cannot undo tonight." I nodded. "No, but I wish I could." For the first time all evening, I saw genuine remorse. Not embarrassment. Not fear. Regret. Edward finally spoke. "Richard always said that mistakes reveal people." Everyone turned toward him. "He said pride hides character until life removes it." He looked at Michael. "And tonight, life removed it." Michael lowered his eyes. He knew Edward was right. The room no longer saw him as a successful CEO. They saw him as a son. And perhaps that mattered more. I reached into my purse. The small, wrapped box remained inside. Richard's watch. I held it carefully. Michael looked at it. His breathing became uneven. "Is that Dad's?" I nodded. "He wanted you to have it." I placed the box into his hands. He stared at it. I don't deserve this. My voice became soft. Your father didn't leave it to a perfect son. I gently closed his fingers around the box. He left it to his son. More tears came. Several people quietly cried. Because Richard had somehow accomplished something none of us could. He had reminded everyone in that room what truly mattered. Not buildings, not investments, not status. Family. And as Michael held his father's watch and his father's letter, I realized that Richard had been preparing this moment long before any of us understood why. But one question still remained. Could a family broken by pride find its way back, or had the damage become too deep to repair? The ballroom felt different now. Not quieter, not louder, just heavier. Michael stood in front of me, holding his father's letter, still shaken from what he had just read. His hands never stopped trembling, as if the words on that paper had permanently changed something inside him. Olivia stood a few steps behind him, silent, her confidence completely gone. The woman who had ordered security only an hour earlier now looked like someone who had just realized she had misjudged an entire life. Edward Sullivan, Margaret Ellis, and the other investors remained close, but they no longer spoke. They were watching us like witnesses at something far more personal than business. Michael finally broke the silence. Mom, his voice cracked. I don't know how to fix this. I looked at him for a long moment. For the first time that night, I didn't see the CEO of Whitaker Living. I saw my son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had protected, the boy who had once fallen asleep on my shoulder after losing his father. I gently shook my head. You don't fix this quickly. Michael. He swallowed hard. I should have stopped it. I should have said something when Olivia... He stopped, unable to finish. Olivia flinched at her name. I thought I was protecting the company, she whispered. I thought appearances mattered more tonight. Edward immediately responded. Appearances are temporary. Respect is permanent. Those words hit her hard. She lowered her eyes. Michael turned toward her slowly. His voice was quiet, but firm. You humiliated my mother. Olivia's breath caught. I didn't know who she was. Michael shook his head. That's not the point. Silence spread again. Even the investors stayed still, because everyone understood that this was no longer about money. It was about truth. It was about what happens when success blinds people to the ones who built the foundation. I finally spoke. My husband used to say something, I said softly. Everyone turned toward me. He said, a company is only as strong as the people it forgets to honor. Margaret nodded slowly. Richard always said things like that. A faint smile appeared on my face at the memory. He was right. Michael stepped closer. Mom, I need you to tell me something. I met his eyes. Anything. His voice broke again. When did I become someone who would allow this to happen? The question hung in the air. Heavy, honest, painful. I took a slow breath. You didn't become that person overnight. I said. You became that person slowly, one decision at a time, one silence at a time. He closed his eyes. Each word hurt him. But I was proud, he whispered. I was building everything Dad worked for. You were, I said gently. But somewhere along the way, you started believing the building mattered more than the people who built it. Olivia covered her mouth, tears falling freely now. I was wrong, she said again, her voice shaking. I was so wrong. Edward stepped forward slightly. Recognizing that is the first step, he said. But it doesn't undo what happened tonight. Michael nodded. I know. He looked at me again. I don't deserve forgiveness. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Because as a mother, hearing your child say that feels like failure in itself. I reached out and touched his hand. You don't get to decide what you deserve, I said softly. That's not how love works. His breath hitched. But I do need to see change, I added. He nodded immediately. Whatever it takes. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom returned in small fragments, whispers, shifting chairs, distant camera shutters. The outside world was trying to resume itself. But inside this circle, something irreversible had already happened. James Holloway stepped forward again. I think Richard anticipated this moment more clearly than anyone, he said quietly. Michael looked up. What do you mean? James adjusted his glasses. He didn't just leave a letter. The room went still again. Olivia blinked. What else is there? James hesitated. Then he spoke. There are conditions tied to the founder agreements. Edward immediately frowned. Conditions? James nodded. Your father ensured that certain rights could only remain active if the founding principles were respected. Michael looked confused. What principles? James answered simply. Respect, continuity, acknowledgement. A silence followed. Then he added something heavier. If those principles are violated, the governance structure can be challenged. Olivia's face went pale again. You're saying, what exactly? James met her eyes. I'm saying tonight has consequences beyond emotion. The words landed like stone. Michael looked overwhelmed. So what happens now? James looked at me before answering. That depends on Nancy. All eyes turned toward me again. I felt their attention differently this time. Not judgment, not curiosity, responsibility. But I didn't want responsibility. I wanted peace. I looked at Michael. I don't want to destroy what you built. His eyes softened slightly. I know, I continued. But I also won't allow what your father and I built to be erased. A quiet understanding formed between us. Edward nodded slowly. That is reasonable, Margaret added softly. It is more than reasonable. Olivia wiped her tears. I will step back from decision-making if that is what's needed, she said quickly. I never wanted to hurt this family. Michael looked at her. For the first time, his voice softened. I know. A long silence followed. Then Michael did something unexpected. He turned toward the entire room. I want everyone here to understand something. All attention shifted. This company was built on my parents' sacrifice. Not mine. Not Olivia's. Not anyone in this room's investment. He looked at me. My mother is not a guest here. His voice strengthened. She is the foundation. My chest tightened. I hadn't expected that sentence. Not tonight. Not ever. Michael continued. And if I ever forget that again, I don't deserve to lead it. The room was completely silent. Edward slowly nodded. That is the first honest thing you've said all night. A few nervous laughs broke the tension, but no one denied it. Michael walked toward me again. This time, slower, more careful. He stopped in front of me. I can't undo tonight, he said. I know. But I can start over. I studied his face. The fear was still there. The regret. The exhaustion. But something else, too. Sincerity. I don't expect things to return to how they were, he added. They won't, I said honestly. He nodded. But I want to rebuild it properly. I took a long breath. Richard's watch was still in his hands. His letter was still in his heart. And now, for the first time that night, I saw something I hadn't seen earlier. A possibility, not perfect, not healed, but real. Then start by remembering, I said softly, that success without respect will always fall apart eventually. He nodded. I will. And for the first time since I entered that ballroom, I believed he meant it. The silence in the ballroom no longer felt like shock. It felt like understanding, slowly, painfully. People were beginning to process what Richard's letter had revealed, what Edward and the others had confirmed, and what I myself had quietly lived through for decades. I remained seated at the table, still holding Michael's hand in one of mine, while the other rested on Richard's pocket watch. It felt warmer now. Not just metal. Memory. Michael had not let go of the letter. He kept rereading parts of it, as if each pass might reveal something he had missed. Olivia stood a few steps behind him, still crying quietly, her earlier confidence completely gone. She no longer looked like the woman who had controlled the evening. She looked like someone realizing the weight of consequences. Edward finally broke the silence again. I think something needs to be said clearly, he announced. All eyes turned to him. He looked around the ballroom. This company was never just a business venture. He paused. It was a partnership built on trust, sacrifice, and shared vision. His gaze landed on Michael. And tonight has shown us what happens when that foundation is forgotten. Michael lowered his head. I understand, he said quietly. Edward nodded once. Understanding is the beginning, but repair requires action. The words hung in the air. James Holloway stepped forward again, closing his briefcase. I've seen many companies rise and fall, he said calmly, and the ones that survive long-term are never the ones with the best products. He looked at the audience. They are the ones that remember their origins. Margaret Ellis spoke next. Richard Whitaker used to tell me something I never forgot. She turned slightly toward me. He said success is dangerous when it stops recognizing the hands that built it. A few people nodded. Others remained silent, reflecting. Michael finally looked up at me again. His voice was softer now. Mom, what do I do? The question wasn't about business. It wasn't about investors. It was about life, about family, about everything he had lost without realizing it. I took a slow breath. You stop trying to fix tonight as if it can be erased, I said gently. You accept it happened, and then you decide what kind of person you want to be tomorrow. He closed his eyes for a moment. I don't want to lose you, he said. My heart tightened. You already almost did, I answered honestly. That truth hurt him, but it needed to be spoken. Silence followed. Then I continued. But losing someone doesn't always mean they're gone forever. He looked up quickly. There is a difference, I said, between being hurt and being gone. Olivia stepped forward hesitantly. Nancy, she said quietly, if you allow me, I would like to step back from company decisions for a while. Michael turned toward her. Olivia, she shook her head. No, I need to do this. Her voice trembled. I need to learn how to listen before I speak again. The sincerity in her words was real. I nodded slowly. That may be wise. She exhaled shakily. I am sorry for all of it. I believed her apology was genuine, but apologies alone do not rebuild trust. Time does. Actions do. Michael looked between us both, overwhelmed. I don't know how to move forward, he admitted. Edward stepped closer. Then start small. Michael looked at him. Start by acknowledging publicly what your mother means to this company. A few investors nodded in agreement. Then, Edward continued, restore what was removed. Michael looked confused. The history. Edward shook his head. Respect. The word landed heavily. Michael turned to me again. I want to fix this properly, he said. I studied him carefully. I believe you want to, I answered. But wanting is not enough. He nodded. I know. For the first time that night, there was no defensiveness in his voice, only humility. James added quietly, your father planned for moments like this. Michael looked at him. What do you mean? James opened his briefcase again, this time removing a smaller document. Richard left guidance beyond the letter. He placed it on the table. This includes instructions for restoring founder recognition in company governance and public history. Michael blinked. He planned that. James nodded. He feared something like tonight could happen. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard, even after death, he had been protecting me, protecting us. Michael looked at the document. I will implement everything, he said firmly. Edward nodded approvingly. Good. A long pause followed. The tension that had filled the ballroom earlier was now replaced by something more fragile: honesty. The investors slowly began to relax, though no one left. They were witnessing something rare. Not a collapse, a correction. Michael turned back to me. "I want you to come back," he said. I shook my head immediately. He looked startled. "Not to work," I clarified, "but to be seen." Silence. Then I added softly, "Not hidden, not erased, not spoken about only when convenient." His eyes filled again. "I understand." Edward looked around the room. "I think tonight should end differently than it began." A few people nodded. He raised his glass slightly. "To Nancy Whitaker." The room hesitated. Then, one by one, people raised their glasses, not as investors, not as executives, but as witnesses. I felt a wave of emotion rise inside me. Richard was not there physically, but I felt him in every acknowledgement, every glance, every silent apology. Michael stepped closer and knelt beside me again, this time not in collapse, but in humility. "I will do better," he said. I placed my hand on his head gently. "I know," I whispered. And for the first time since I walked into that ballroom, I believed that tomorrow might not look like tonight. But it would take time, a lot of it, because healing a broken family is not a single moment. It is a long road walked step by step, and we had only just taken the first one. The ballroom no longer felt like a place for business. It felt like a place where something had ended and something else had begun. People were still standing in small clusters, talking quietly, but the energy had completely shifted. The Harbor Point launch, the project that was supposed to define Michael's career, had faded into the background. Screens still showed architectural visuals, but no one was watching them anymore. They were watching us. Me, Michael, Olivia, and the quiet space between everything we had been and everything we were becoming. Michael still stood near me, holding his father's letter in one hand and the pocket watch in the other. He hadn't stopped looking at either since reading the final words. Olivia stood a few steps away, no longer the confident woman who had controlled the event. She looked smaller now, more human, more uncertain. Edward Sullivan finally spoke softly. "I think tonight has changed more than one company." A few investors nodded. Margaret Ellis squeezed my hand gently. "Sometimes truth arrives late," she said. "But when it does, it arrives completely." I looked at her. "I never wanted this kind of attention," I said quietly. Edward smiled faintly. "People like you never do." Michael stepped closer to me. His voice was softer than I had heard in years. "Mom, what happens now?" It was a simple question, but it carried everything. The future of the company, the future of our family, the future of what we had lost. I took a slow breath. "Now," I said gently. "We stopped pretending nothing happened." He nodded immediately. "I don't want to go back to how things were," he admitted. I studied him carefully. Good, I replied. Because you can't. That truth did not hurt him the way it once would have. He accepted it now. Olivia finally stepped forward again. Her voice was fragile. I would like to apologize properly, she said. She looked at me directly. Not as a wife of a CEO, not as an executive, just as a person who made a very serious mistake. The room remained quiet. I nodded slowly. I accept your apology, I said. Relief washed over her face, but I raised a hand slightly. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. She understood immediately. I understand. Michael looked between us. I don't want this to destroy the company, he said. Edward responded calmly. It won't if you rebuild it correctly. James Holloway added quietly. Your father already gave you the structure for that. Michael looked down at the letter again. I just wish I had listened to him sooner. I placed my hand gently on his arm. Your father didn't write that letter because he expected perfection, I said softly. He wrote it because he believed in correction. That seemed to calm him slightly. For the first time all night, Michael exhaled fully. Then he did something unexpected. He turned toward the entire ballroom. His voice carried more clearly now. I want to say something to everyone here. The room quieted again. Even servers stopped moving. Michael continued. My mother is Nancy Whitaker. He paused. The co-founder of Whitaker Living. A few people nodded, already knowing. But more importantly, he said, she is the reason this company exists at all. Olivia lowered her head. Michael's voice strengthened. And I failed to protect her tonight. The honesty of that sentence made the room even quieter. I will not ask anyone to forget what they saw, he continued. But I will ask you to judge me by what I do next. Edward nodded approvingly. Margaret whispered. Good. Michael turned back to me. I want you involved again, he said. I shook my head gently. Not in management, I clarified. He nodded quickly. Not control, not pressure, just presence. I considered this. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I spoke. I will come back, I said finally. But on my terms. He nodded immediately. Anything. I will not be erased again. His answer was instant. You won't be. A quiet shift moved through the room again, not tension this time, but acceptance. James closed his briefcase. Then I believe Richard's intention has been fulfilled, he said. I looked at him. He always said he wanted this family to survive itself. James added. Edward raised his glass once more. To correction, he said simply. Several people echoed him. To correction. Not celebration. Not success. Correction. I looked around the ballroom one final time. Not as someone who had been humiliated. Not as someone who had been rescued. But as someone whose life had been fully seen again after years of being quietly forgotten. Michael stepped closer and gently placed the pocket watch into my hands. I think this belongs with you tonight, he said softly. I shook my head. No, I replied. It belongs to both of us now. He looked at me, confused. I continued. Your father didn't leave it as a memory of the past. I placed his hand over it. He left it as a reminder for the future. Michael nodded slowly. And for the first time since everything began, he didn't argue. He understood. Olivia stepped closer again, her voice soft. Nancy, I hope one day I can earn your trust again. I looked at her. Trust is not given by words, I said gently. It is built by time. She nodded. I will try. I believed she would, not because she deserved it yet, but because she finally understood the cost of losing it. Edward looked around the room one final time. I think this evening is over, he said. No one disagreed. One by one, guests began to leave. The grand event slowly dissolved into silence, footsteps, and soft closing doors. Michael stayed beside me until the end. When the room was almost empty, he spoke quietly. Mom, I don't want to lose you again. I looked at him. You won't, I said, but you will have to learn how to keep what matters. He nodded. I will. Outside the ballroom, Seattle rain continued falling softly against the glass. The city looked the same as it had when I arrived, but I was not the same woman who had walked in, and neither was my son. As we stepped out together into the night, I finally understood something Richard had known all along. That love does not disappear when it is broken. It waits. For honesty, for humility, for return. And tonight, after everything, we had finally begun to find our way back. Before this story ends, I want to ask you something from the heart. Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt forgotten or disrespected by the people closest to you? What do you think matters more in the end? Success, or the love and respect of family? I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment sharing your feelings. And tell me where you are watching from. If this story touched you, please remember to like and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. Your support truly means a lot and helps these stories continue.